Time now for the Sunday Talk. Tonight, the politics of corporate indignation. There has been a growing backlash against U.S. laws that allow for discrimination against gay and transgender people. As many as 22 states are considering this kind of legislation. As usual, celebrities have been vocal, but now corporations are threatening to pull their businesses from some of these states in a way we've never seen before. New religious freedom laws in North Carolina and Mississippi allow businesses to refuse some services to gay people.
It simply protects someone's religious views against the state's interference.
Part of the law says people must use the bathroom that matches the sex on their birth certificates, causing problems for transgender people.
If my son can't go to the men's room with his beard, he's not going to be able to go to the women's room with his beard.
It's meant to calm fears of attacks by predatory men dressing up as women, despite there being no evidence this ever happens.
You give the green light when you put a standard out there of feelings for people who are sexual predators.
I want to live my life, and this guy wants to call me a rapist.
Protests erupted. Celebrities spoke out.
And I think the law is ridiculous, of course.
And musicians canceled concerts. And now businesses are pulling out of North Carolina. PayPal was first, scrapping plans to open an office that would employ over 400 people. Deutsche Bank froze a plan to create 250 jobs. Lionsgate canceled plans to film a movie there, costing the state another 100 jobs. And more than 90 other big firms, including Bank of America, Google, and Microsoft, signed a letter to the governor urging him to repeal the law.
I find these to be really effective because these are big corporations that are protesting. And when you have IBM and Walmart, of all people, and General Electric and people like that coming at you, it affects people.
I'm joined by our panelists now. Tasha Carradine is a columnist with the National Post and iPolitics. Jonathan Kay is editor-in-chief at Walrus Magazine. And David Simmons is a public affairs strategist for a large corporation who, before he got so important, was a Sunday Talk panelist. Welcome back, David. In the corporate world, before that you were what journalists call a spin doctor. Now you're in the corporate world watching all of this. You always keep your ear to the ground. How important is this for corporations? Why is it so big and where is it going?
I think ultimately companies like mine and others are a reflection of the people that make them up in the communities that they operate in. And for the first time in a long time, the public is well ahead of lawmakers on issues of LGBT rights in the United States. And so it's incumbent on companies that have values, that talk about those values, that go out and get licensed to operate with those values to then react when called upon. And I think you're seeing that in the U.S. You're seeing leaders say we're going to be leaders, and we're kind of fed up with draconian, archaic approaches to rights.
What do you think, Tash? I mean, do corporations deserve a medal here, or is there a little bit of this kind of like greenwashing, rainbow style?
Well, rainbow washing, I guess you could say. I mean, companies do things that people applaud, such as this. They will say this is great because they happen to agree with the stance the companies are taking. However, companies could do this in other places they choose not to. For example, Saudi Arabia discriminates against LGBT people. They discriminate against women. I'm sure a lot of these companies probably do business there. You don't see them standing up and trying to say, we're going to divest, and if you don't change your laws. I think it's selective. I think it's partly because it looks good for these companies, and there's a big public backlash, like you said, against these laws, so they're riding that bandwagon.
We actually did a bit of research. It's hardly encyclopedic, but tried to find other issues in the past where companies have, on this scale, taken this kind of movement, and we couldn't really find anything comparable. So why this and why now, John?
I think the reason it's now is because, on one hand, you have a sort of social panic that's gripping parts of the United States. The conservatives know that they're losing the culture war, especially on issues of sexual identity. And so politicians have to respond to that social panic. And in your intro package, you talked, I think it was 22 states that are considering this kind of law. Corporations, on the other hand, don't have to respond to social panic. What they have to respond to is the need to get high-quality knowledge workers. So if you look at the companies that are disproportionately represented, you have companies like Facebook, you have companies like Google, PayPal. One of their prime mandates is to go out and get the smartest, most capable young people they can into their digital workforce. And often these are people who are extremely progressive in their politics. Here in Canada, we've had Richard Florida is an urban specialist who's talked a lot about how often, whether a city is LGBT friendly, will dictate whether it's attractive to young knowledge workers, and not necessarily just gay workers or transgendered workers, all young workers, because they take attitudes toward LGBT as a proxy for how sophisticated you are and how progressive you are.
So is this like a divide between employees and, I mean, these are Republican states. The same-sex marriage laws have just been passed. Is this kind of this is a divide?
I think, you know, 56% of Americans, last time they were surveyed, are supportive of LGBT rights in some way, shape, or form. John's right. There's a war for talent in the United States. There's a war for talent in Canada. And it's not just millennials or young workers. We're seeing older workers also become more progressive as their sons and their daughters identify as gay and lesbian and come out of the closet. So it's an opportunity to do the right thing at the right time. Yet I think Tasha's right. There's different extremes. There's environmental policy. There's racial issues. There's gender issues. But I think we should push organizations to continue speaking out on the issues that matter.
I think there also might be an issue here because it's affecting business. Businesses are the ones saying we want to have the right to refuse service, for example. Businesses are saying you have to use a certain bathroom. So companies always get demonized. It's kind of funny. We always say, oh, corporations have no soul. They are terrible. When they do something like this, oh, they're great. They're acting for the common good. But really, I think they're also trying to protect their image in a situation where companies are actually being affected directly by these laws. I'm not saying it's bad or good. I don't think that companies per se are social actors. I think they are legal persons, but they are made up of people. In some cases, they are private corporations, and in that case, arguably, you can do what you want with your corporation. But if you're held by shareholders, a mass of public shareholders, those individuals may not all agree with the goal of the corporation here or the companies it gives money to. And so, they are acting in a way that they think is right, but some people might disagree with.
But they're going to agree with the bottom line if it's profitable. And an example here in Toronto, I know that during Pride Week in Toronto, where we're taping this, I know that my bank happens to be the TD Bank, and not necessarily a shout out for the TD Bank. Part of their corporate strategy in past years has been that they have gone all in on Pride events. And so when you go to TD branches, not necessarily in the neighborhood where the Pride events take place, you will see rainbow paraphernalia everywhere. It has become part of their marketing identity, and I think that's about the bottom line. I think that is about making themselves a progressive-minded bank.
I think it's also about doing, this is an issue that's fundamentally about people, right? I think Tasha's brought up a lot of good points about the environment and human rights. I get Tasha's point, it's an important one, but when people are being persecuted in your backyard in a place like Canada or in a place like the United States, I think it's incumbent upon leaders who talk about their values openly. Most of these CEOs have blogs now. They're monitoring social media. They can hear from their customer directly without mediator, and employees are saying, hey, that's not right. That doesn't feel good, and we want you to do something about it.
But do we want corporations to always do things? I agree in this case. I like what they're doing. I think that it's, I agree with their point of view. But other situations, for example, the boycott, divest Israel movement, for example, I would disagree with a corporation that would boycott Israel on the basis of that movement. So it's hard to have it both ways. I think people want to, but you can't.
Well, it is interesting because it's sort of looking as if the corporations are saying, okay, we're in charge now. We're going to help determine social policy. Is that good? Should we trust them? How far could this go?
Well, it's interesting. I think they're doing it in the United States because politicians in many red states, which is to say Republican states, have just abdicated rational policymaking. When you have politicians who give in wholeheartedly to social panic, the corporate leaders essentially become the only adults in the room. So that has not happened in Canada.
So social panic as in overreacting to
large, in some cases, largely imaginary issues. I mean, the example of transgendered people dressing up and using the issue as an excuse to be sexual predators in bathrooms, as was said in the setup piece, it's a completely imaginary problem. It was just totally made up. That's social panic.
This has happened in Canada. If you remember when Mel Lastman was mayor,
David,
Toronto.
Yeah, that's a decade ago. Though,
it was a decade ago, but David Picot got his Bay Street friends together and said, we're going to be the opposition to the mayor of the city of Toronto because you're holding back development here, right? So and it wasn't on human rights issues, but it was on issues that were affecting the social culture and climate of the city. It happened in Calgary as well. So I think...
And it happened with Ford a little bit too, you could argue.
So we're getting a bit too Toronto-ish here. But I'm wondering, the comparison is being made, Tasha, to this is it's like the civil rights movement, and there's no stories yet of people being turned away from lunch counters. I won't give you a burger because you're gay.
Maybe.
But is that a legitimate comparison?
Well, I think
this is like a civil rights moment where people are going to be refused just because they're gay?
Well, I think, look, the civil rights movement affected a lot more people than this did. It's the same type of issue. And I think because of the civil rights movement, there are fewer and fewer issues like this of smaller segments of people who still have not achieved equality. And I think that the LGBT community is at that vanguard because they are still fighting for these rights as people of color were fighting like 50 years ago in the civil rights movement. So yes, you definitely have smaller segments who are fighting for similar rights. But the issue of the corporation fighting for their rights is interesting because, like I said, we tend to say when corporations ask, for example, say, oh, we want to have a tax break or else we won't put jobs in your state, or we want the government to do certain things. They pressure governments all the time for things. It just happens in this case, they're pressuring on a human rights issue that a lot of people think is the right one.
Which is the right thing to do at the right time. I think.
But they do the wrong thing too.
And I don't think that's in dispute. I think what's important here, and I think African Americans and Black Canadians are still fighting for rights in a lot of different spaces. What's important here around the LGBT issue is that there's a number of people pushing from the outside in as well, right? So I think if you look at, and I talk about this sometimes, and it's a little bit provocative, but a lot of white men are impacted by this issue where they may not be directly impacted by issues of race or gender, right? So Tim Cook, for example, is able to come out as a CEO of Apple. He's in the most powerful position in that company. And so Tone from the Top is able to move that corporation in a direction that it otherwise may not. So I think, there's probably going to be more of this as women, African Americans, people of color move up the ranks in organizations. You might see companies starting to be more vocal on issues they weren't before.
And is that a good thing? Last quick point, John, is that?
I think it's a good thing, but it's going to become another conflict point between private American enterprise and governors of states, because you're going to see a backlash against some of these companies. Although I don't think it's any surprise that a lot of these companies are essentially monopolies. Are you going to boycott PayPal or Facebook because you don't like their position on LGBT issues? Probably not. So a lot of these, especially digital companies, are in an extremely strong position to press social values because no one's probably going to boycott them.
Fascinating times, backlash against maybe another backlash, but we'll see what happens. Thanks so much. Nice to have you back, Dave.
Thanks, Wendy.